and I actually have another project that we've been working on for a number of years. We call it Dr. Pennsylvania. If you listen to Dr. Pennsylvania, you're mostly going to hear me talking about folklore and historical events that are specific to Pennsylvania, hence the alias Nick Pennsylvania. Occasionally, we dig deep into the newspaper archives and we pull up interesting articles which we read verbatim. And it was in that quest that I came upon an article which I'm going to read in a moment. Before I do, though, I need to talk about another place that isn't Pennsylvania. I need to talk about Nova Scotia because there, in the 1920s, there was quite a bit of media attention surrounding a farm. Those of you who are listening to this are probably more likely than the average person to be somewhat familiar with the spiritualist movement that was all the rage, especially in the late 19th century. You might be familiar too with such charlatans as the Fox sisters of New York's burning region. If so, there's a chance that a lot of the variables in this story are going to sound familiar. Bottom line, there is a story around Mary Ellen McDonald. She was the adopted teen daughter of the McDonalds who lived in a little area outside of Antigonish, Nova Scotia called Caledonia Mills, where they had a farm. On that farm, there was a series of mysterious fires, and it came to be believed that the young lady was somehow a fire starter. There was some sort of ghostly paranormal, some sort of poltergeist activity. You can look this up if you like. It is still a pretty well-known story throughout Eastern Canada. And it was so well-known that in the Philadelphia Evening Ledger, March 17, 1922, I came across a series of articles about these incidents. Not only were they reported across Canada, but pretty widely across the United States and even across the Atlantic, where they received the attention of Arthur Conan Doyle, among others, who, this is a bit of a side, despite the detective novels, the scientific detective novels for which he is most well known today, he was a pretty silly, gullible man who was fooled by paper fairy photography. It's a bit embarrassing. The bottom line is there was a lot of attention paid to this young lady and the family farm. It reminds me a lot of the Amityville horror stories. The newspaper article I'm going to read, though, which was on the front page of the Philadelphia Evening Ledger, March 17, 1922, is written by a professor at Philadelphia's Temple University that he believes he has previous experience with this family who were then at the time living near Missoula, Montana, near the Canadian border. And this doctor is going to lay his case out, but I think it's pretty interesting. I also think it's pretty interesting how very little seems to have changed in the way of these kind of fakery or quackery, as the newspaper calls it. So let me read this article to you. Scientists here laid low another McDonald ghost. A subheadline states that Dr. T.L. Bolton exposed quackery of nocturnal visitor to family of the same name as in Antigonish with a Mary Ellen. An episode coincident in many remarkable respects to the recent happenings at Antigonish, Nova Scotia, which excited the wonder of half the world and which are now said to have been inspired by a ghost discarnate in Mary Ellen MacDonald, has been brought to light by Dr. Thaddeus L. Bolton, professor of psychology at Temple University. The episode, investigated by Dr. Bolton, occurred near Missoula, Montana in the spring of 1913, and so insistent is the parallel, even the names of the temperamental characteristics of the principal actor, that Dr. Bolton decided to make it public. At that time, Dr. Bolton had the chair of psychology at the University of Montana in Missoula, a little town in a valley of the Blackfoot Mountains not far from the Canadian border. The supposedly supernatural manifestations of that occasion Dr. Bolton found to be palatable fraud brought on by a desire for notoriety, whether merely to gratify a megalomania or for some subtle purpose, he is not certain. The case, said Dr. Bolton, was brought to my attention by Joseph M. Dixon, then but lately out of the United States Senate and now governor of the state. It seemed that a Canadian family by the name of MacDonald, who had been living in a mountain gulch some 8 or 9 miles out of Missoula, had been disturbed by a series of phenomena and wanted an investigation. I told him to send them to me, and the next day MacDonald called on me. MacDonald was then a youngish good-looking man of about 35. He was shy and reticent, and then and during the rest of my acquaintance with him I got very little out of him. He told me, however, that he was a salesman of high-class liquors for a Canadian firm. He had a matter-of-fact enough way that the phenomena at his house concerned the spirit knockings during the night, ghostly visions, and other somewhat stranger things. I said I should like to visit his house, and he invited me to come on the following evening. In the meantime, I made inquiries concerning the family. I learned they had come to Missoula about a year previously and had built the house in the mountains, that nobody knew much more of them than that. A storm was gathering as I made the journey out in a horse and buggy over the frightful roads that were almost blocked in parts by fallen limbs of trees and other ravages of winter. That country is scarcely populated. There seems to be a certain ghostliness about it. You came upon this house of the MacDonalds suddenly, for although there was only one neighbor for miles about, it was hidden from sight of the road by great trees. It was a big house for these parts, but built somewhat in the design of a log cabin, according to strange architecture. There was a great archway over the door, for example. The interior walls were left naked. That is, they were not plastered nor painted, but the lumber was arranged in a fantastic fashion that could not have been accidental. Moreover, a number of strange designs had been carved into it. My hostess surprised me greatly. My first thought that it was strange of MacDonald to have married a woman at least 12 years older than himself. This seemed even stranger when I learned from Mrs. MacDonald that they had been married but a short time, and still more strange when I was told that they had a small son about 7 months old. Mrs. MacDonald had what I might call a seasoned face. She seemed to be a woman who had lived a life hard with curious people in curious places, as indeed she was doing now. This was to an extent confirmed by her conversation. She had been a nurse, she said, and she had spent a considerable time in South Africa during and after the Boer Wars. She had been several times, she said, in the United States and Canada, but in spite of this, she and MacDonald spoke with strong Scottish-English accents. A cook, housemaid, and an adopted daughter named Mary Ellen, about 9 years old, made up the household. The central or living room downstairs had a ceiling about 14 or 15 feet above the floor. An extraordinary thing in a mountain lodge, the room was hung with dozens of oil paintings and pastels, almost all of them bizarre in theme and vivid in the contrast of colors. They were done by a person of considerable talent and technical skill. In reply to a question, Mrs. MacDonald said that they were her own work, but this I impolitely disbelieved. The dinner consisted of dishes particularly English. Mrs. MacDonald said she had prepared them herself. After the meal, wines were produced, and my glass was plied heavily. Then for the first time I was allowed to see Mary Ellen, who, although I had reason to suspect her as the medium of these phenomena, had been kept carefully in the background. She was brought out and made to recite a number of pieces, and this she did with a good deal of histrionic emphasis and a precocious sense of what she was talking about. She had features that were somewhat older for her age. When she was to be put to bed, she became very demonstrative and affected. She kissed me and everyone else in the room effusively. After this, Mrs. MacDonald endeavored to lead the talk around to the ghosts and supernatural things generally, while MacDonald kept on plying me with wine. I resisted for a while, and then let things drift, and at about 9:30, the first manifestations occurred. I should make it plain that these manifestations had all come from upstairs room next to the one in which Mary Ellen slept. This night the ghost made no exception. After the knockings, Mrs. MacDonald began to evince signs of hysteria. She put questions to the ghost regarding its identity, and the ghost answered according to the code that seems accepted among them all. One knock for the answer no, two knocks for yes, and so on. What impressed me was a certain vague but distinct dramatic quality in which the answers that were given, and I decided that it was the same quality I had observed in a little girl when she made her recitations. After a time we all repaired to the upstairs rooms where the sound seemed to originate, and there got on closer terms with the ghost. Mrs. McDonald gave way to a debauch of emotion. She laughed hysterically, wept, sang, and gave the ghost various affectionate assurances. The seance continued until about 11 o'clock, ending gradually as the responses were first difficult and then impossible to get. At 11:30 I asked to see Mary Ellen. She was brought out of the bed in a dazed, half-dream state that is common to somnambulists. This confirmed the decision I had earlier in the evening that the phenomena were produced by Mary Ellen while in a somnambulistic state induced by self-hypnotism. In spite of protests from my host, I left at midnight, driving home through one of the worst blizzards of the year. I had promised to write the McDonalds a letter setting forth my conclusions. This I did the following day. I learned afterwards that Mrs. McDonald, before coming to Missoula, had run a fortune-telling establishment in Butte, and heard also the present business of McDonald was smuggling goods across the border. I saw them several times afterwards, but I never visited the house again. A few months after the instances I have narrated, the house in the mountain gulch burned down, paintings and all, I suppose, and there was never any further trace of the McDonalds or their servants. In reading accounts of the supposedly ghostly visitations at Antigonish, I was struck with the similarity of the phenomenon and the characteristics of the medium. The coincidence grew almost conclusive when I remembered the name of the family who lived near Missoula. That was 9 years ago. The Mary Ellen of Missoula should be now about 18, the age, according to reports, of Mary Ellen of Antigonish. Not much can be told from a photograph, but there is in the face of the Mary Ellen of Antigonish the same cast and expression that I observed in the child at Missoula.
Well, all right, Brendan, you've been able to hear the article. I know you've been able to take some time to look into these stories a little deeper. I clearly have spent the last 12, 13 minutes talking. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is a really interesting article. First off was kind of like the provenance of it, that it seems like when looking back on it, really just even without doing a ton of searching, this case was pretty famous in the area. And I was kind of surprised I'd never heard about it. This is usually I think a good sign for, I guess, really any story from the era, because there was so much sensationalism in media at the time. It's just trying to sell newspapers, much like today. The more names you have associated with the story that have legitimacy in the sense of, okay, we know these are actual people who did other things besides just exist in this story, which is always, I think, a good sign for an article, because we've run across plenty of articles over the years where just by the lack of other people being involved, or I know you've pointed out before, the writer seeming to know things that otherwise they wouldn't if it wasn't a pseudo embellished or made up story. This article didn't seem to have much of that. It didn't have a lot of the typical red flags I look for in a made up sensationalized article of the time. So as far as the context of that, was that kind of your impression too?
I mean, to me, it very much read just like a letter to the editor that was published on the front page, because this was a story that, for whatever reason, was getting a lot of attention. And I know what you're referring to when you're talking about some of these. In the past, when I've read older newspapers, particularly those of the 19th century, the early 19th century, and particularly more rural rags, we'll call them, there were these crazy stories. Do you recall I read the one, we recorded one where it was about a snake had bitten a boy and curled up
Oh,
inside the boy's stomach and then gestated there
that was a
for a
wild
few
story.
months.
Yeah.
It was weird. And it's like that clearly did not happen in any
Mhm.
way, shape, or
Yeah,
form.
exactly. Yeah.
It was the closest thing to reality was that a boy existed and a snake existed and the boy had a stomach. And but there was another one that, as you were talking, I was remembering, which was specific about land sales, and the person that was writing in, it was clearly somebody in the land, the
Oh,
business of selling the land,
talking about
and
how
it was
great it
just,
was and everything. Yeah, I do remember that
yeah.
one. It was.
And that was clearly one of those things like
Mhm.
there's no way you know this unless you're the person selling the land and you're just too enthusiastic
Mhm.
that any sane person should be suspicious of
Right.
you and of the
Yes.
paper in general.
Yes. And I think that's why, and I completely agree. And that's kind of what I was looking for going into this article, is any of those kind of typical red flags that kind of give us some context.
I definitely got this as, hey, here's one of our local professors writing in about this story that we've been running these past few days. We're going to put it up front because clearly this is a story getting a lot of interest. And this is this is a credible person. I didn't research that professor any further than that. I don't know if you have, but
I mean, only to the extent that he did exist. You know, he does come up at other times and everything. So again, it wasn't like someone was saying, "Oh, the local professor Jimmy Jimerson of Jimtown, son of
from the
Jim."
famous Jim family.
Yeah, from the famous Jimtown Gyms. You know, once you kind of get past that, you have this story that anyone who even has a cursory knowledge of poltergeist stories is going to be familiar with this one, which in itself I think of as kind of more telling of the time that we're living in, because when we hear how this story starts and what's going on, we kind of know all the beats that are going to happen. When looking into this, he refers to the family in Montana. Was it Missoula or Helena?
No, he at the time was a professor over at Missoula, as I
Yeah.
recall, and he was told about this family. So he's writing
Hmm.
again, just to make it clear to
Hmm.
everybody listening. There was these stories about out Nova Scotia of
Hmm.
this farm,
Hmm.
these poltergeist type activities, fire settings happening.
Hmm.
Well, this professor in
Yes.
Philadelphia now is reading these stories about these happenings up in Nova Scotia,
Hmm.
Canada. And he's saying, well, you know what? 9 years ago, when I was a
Hmm.
professor over in Montana, I met a family with all the same names, ages that kind of line up,
Hmm.
and they kind of had a similar sort of thing going on.
Yeah.
So I mean, I found a lot of satisfaction in the professor's letter, and I'll talk about my
Hmm.
feelings later.
Yeah, because whenever I was looking into it, what I kind of found was there was a lot of other research done on this Nova Scotia case. To kind of give you the quick rundown of what I found through a few websites that seem to mention contemporary sources, basically saying that, you know, there was folks who did research at this place. They went out and there was a lot of evidence that there was this fire starting going on, as well as other kind of typical poltergeist activity. The girl, who was apparently maybe the same girl from Montana, did end up in a insane asylum for the majority of her life afterwards. The impression I got was the story seemed different enough that I don't necessarily think it was the same family, but absolutely could have been the same family, you know. And honestly, the story from this professor's dealings with this family in Montana are honestly more interesting than the Nova Scotia part of the story, I think. Some of the things that he said about this kind of got me thinking. It sounded to me like the wife, the eccentric wife that had a Scottish accent, for some reason. She seemed to be described as much more odd than anybody else in the family, especially when he talked about all the paintings in the house and the carvings on the inside of the walls, him saying that they were hers, you know. And he even said, like, I even impolitely suggested that she couldn't have done them because they were so strange. So like, it just seemed like the dynamic and how he says they were plying him with wine, it seemed like it was just a very strange dynamic. Like, I wasn't sure if they were trying to convince him or trying to convince him that this place was haunted, or that it wasn't. I really wasn't sure which side to even think this guy was being pushed towards. This is actually very different than from a lot of poltergeist stories that we hear, where usually the family is in denial until like it's almost like too late, you know, where this seemed to be kind of strange from the get-go. And you have to almost like wonder, like I started wondering, I'm like, is there other occult stuff going on here besides this young girl possibly having some sort of poltergeist issues? So that was kind of like my takeaway. Whenever he said that he left in the middle of a snowstorm after this stuff, you know, started going on and everything, and how the wife was almost like pleading with the spirits and like talking to them and having them answer, I was like, man, this lady's really like hamming this up. But then he even says that the knocks have a similar like vibe or something to the girl's speech pattern.
Well, I think he was indicating that they were coming from where the area where her room was, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, and it was just everything about it was very, very strange, and it was not what I expected. It's kind of what I'm trying to say.
Well, I'm picking up what you're saying. It's just I felt completely opposite. I felt it was very clear that they were trying to convince this person that this place is haunted, and I think there's a few things that demonstrate that. I think there's a few things that suggest that this is a group con, a family con. However, you bring up something that I hadn't thought about, and that was that this woman, the matriarch in the family, was kind of the focal point of that, was kind of the ringleader. And I think that you might be onto something there, although, of course, everything's speculative. But here's what I worked out. Here's what I was thinking, is that he writes about, well, one, let's talk about being plied with alcohol. I mean, yeah, that could be in part to kind of dull the senses a little bit, to make these things seem more spectacular than they really are.
Yeah.
Or it could just be that they were very good hosts.
Yeah, it could be, culturally, time, and that, like, right. It's hard to, it's going
on that, but that's me joking. But I think it was very clear that they were plying. He used the term plying, and
he did,
and I think it was for that purpose. He states that the child, she appeared older than they said she were, than they said she was, and that she seemed precocious, was reciting some things, was a little too aware, that it might have just been an especially smart child, or it could have been a child that was a bit older. It suggested to me that this child was clearly trained. I think too, he talks about, you know, the wife in the past, it was known in the area, had been a fortune teller, and that the husband had been smuggling goods into the United States. Now, it seems self-evident that they probably come over from England or somewhere in the UK, Scotland, England. We don't know how good this professor was at, you know, pinpointing accents.
Very true.
But Canada itself at this time was not completely divorced from the United Kingdom, as we noticed today. I don't think that the separation fully occurred until I was a very small child. So I think these were British nationals living in Canada. They dipped into Montana, probably in large part for this maybe smuggling operation, duty tax, all that. I don't know how taxes worked back then. I think, too, the occurrences were too predictable. He talks about, you know, they had described, the occurrences had been described to him, and they did not fail to show themselves. It seems like any issues in getting things that happened through the course of the night were predominantly. I mean, it just seemed like they could have been explained by, well, the spirits aren't acting, are slowing down in their activity. Well, that's because the kid upstairs that's making all this knocking happen is getting tired, or is just getting tired of the game.
It's possible.
And,
yeah,
and
that's a good point.
end,
That's a good point. Yeah.
So at the end, it didn't seem like anything was all that fantastical. The fire so the house catches on fire and then they disappear. I think it's clear that they moved on. I don't know if there was any sort of insurance thing with the fire. Or they just
very possible
wanted to be done with it. The things that I think are funny to me about the professor's writing, he talks about how odd some of the aspects of the house are, and it suggests one of two things. It suggests either there is occultish materials around, or that it's just too opulent for just a cabin in the woods, and that's his way of hinting that there's
the structure and everything that he was talking about. Yeah, no, that's I hadn't thought of that angle. That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
It stood out to me because he makes mention of that on several occasions. So I think it was part that they were trying to impart some weirdness, or that they were demonstrating in a way that they had more money than you would have expected to find at a place in this location. The last couple thoughts I had were I did laugh at a couple very dated things, such as self-hypnosis or a somnambulist state.
Yeah. Oh, that was a great word.
The way I said that.
That was a great word too. I looked it up, but I couldn't find. I don't think I could find a definition of that. But it was
you're a film person. I'm sure you are familiar with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Yeah.
And that has the somnambulist in it as well.
Oh, that what that? Okay.
Yeah, the sleeper. Two kind of dated terms that I recoiled a little bit at. But my final thought was this. I think the professor very clearly left either because he was just uncomfortable being around these people, or just, decorum, but that his reflections upon this later in Philadelphia, I think for me are pretty case closed. Of course, this is me putting, I say we should be not speculative, we should be skeptical of all claims. So I don't know how true, obviously, these professors' claims of all this are, but it seems to fit very nicely. I put a lot of confidence in that letter that was written to the paperback all the way 100 some years ago. But from being a fortune teller and a smuggler to amping the con up a little bit to, having these spectacular things going on during a period in time right before World War One, when these Montana happenings were going on, it seems, again, this was a period in time where this was getting a lot of attention. Then to go in Nova Scotia, and now it's ramping up because the things that are occurring are now becoming increasingly spectacular as this child ages, and their training and their ideas and seeing what worked, what hasn't worked. We don't know what other potential places they were trying to pull this off. So I see it as being very clear to me. I think the most probable thing is this is a family con of some sort, and I think I stated that it reminds me an awful lot of like the Amityville story and whatnot, which I think most people interested in this sort of stuff are pretty familiar with.
I think that's probably a very fair reading of like the most likely scenario. But again, I did find it interesting looking up the Nova Scotia side of this, because that really isn't mentioned, like I said, quite as much outside of this reminds me of this thing. The young girl, like I said, her name was Mary Ellen McDonald, who was the proposed fire starter in, how do you pronounce this place? Antigonish?
Yeah,
Antigonish. I'm not good at my, what do they speak up there? Nova Scotian?
English.
English.
No, Nova Scotia is there was Arcadia, Acadia, which is where it was part of the French-speaking colonies in northern North America.
Yeah, I thought they had their own dialect up there or something.
Those folks were kicked down,
okay,
and they became the Cajuns, and New England as well.
Okay. That's kind of
that's where Nova Scotia. It's eastern Canada. Prince Edward Island, Cape Breton.
Yeah.
There are some French pockets there still.
Is Labrador in Nova Scotia, or is that New Brunswick?
Labrador, that's all the Maritimes. That's all eastern coastal. Labrador, if I'm not mistaken, is where you get your blue nosers and things like that, which is a very distinct. It's like the Welsh accent.
Yeah, I know Canada. There's some interesting.
I know, weird.
Yeah, I know linguistically there's some interesting stuff up there, but that makes a lot more sense. I didn't realize. Okay, that makes sense.
Well, and for all the time I've spent in Canada, I've been in Ontario and Quebec almost exclusively. So I really want to get to Prince Edward Island at some point in Cape Breton.
Oh, it looks beautiful.
Obviously,
yeah.
Well, it's obvious. It's also too. There's the huge traditional. Especially fiddle music is
there's a lot
because that island wasn't fully electrified until I think the mid 1960s. So like Ken Perlman came out with a book just a couple of years ago, Couldn't Have a Wedding Without the Fiddler. So traditional music of which clearly I'm very interested, that region has a very important oversized thing because it's a place where the traditions were able to continue without so much radio and other things like that. So that has nothing to do with the story.
Yeah.
That's where Antigonish is at.
Yeah, that's where just my inability to pronounce English words that I haven't heard people say out loud before. Yeah, and looking into that story, it's interesting because like there are some things that line up and some things that don't. Like I said, like this girl's name was Mary Ellen McDonald. She was supposedly 16. All this poltergeist stuff started happening, and there was also a fire. It was investigated also by someone who we talked about before, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He gets involved. The Society for Psychical Research got involved. It really garnered a lot of attention at the time. And one of the main folks from that society, Walter Franklin Prince, who was one of their bigwigs at the time, spent apparently 3 weeks at the farm trying to investigate it and everything. Whereas with this one, the general consensus was that she was kind of making this stuff up. But again, she was put in a local, insane asylum kind of thing. So it's like, well, if she's making it up, what other issues did this woman have kind of thing? There is a lot of stories around it from one of the main investigators, H.B. Whidden, and some other folks a lot of folks had some really serious experiences at this farm, it sounds like. Again, a lot of it kind of sounds like you said, like the Amityville horror stuff, where it's almost like, this stuff is happening in 1922, and you're like, they don't know about these tropes yet. And that's what kind of, again, at least for me, is gives them some air of credibility, because it's like they didn't know I don't know if they would have known what to make up to fall into these categories at the time.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I always thought of the whole idea of poltergeist as being a more modern of all these stories. And that's also one of the reasons why I thought of this as being a ramping up and being on the cutting edge of what all the hip spiritualist stuff is moving towards. And fire setting too, I feel the same. I feel like there are far fewer such stories as, the bump in the night sort of, the cold zone sort of stories. And I will say a couple things. First off, I do think that knowing the mental health care at the time, I do think something terrible is to be said about this woman being placed in an asylum because of what we know about the conditions of the best such facilities at that time and of attitudes at the time about that. And I can't imagine a place where that's justified, because again, if this is all a con, which is the premise I'm offering.
Exactly.
If this is all a con, I mean, clearly this is a capable person But I do feel like there has been a level of abuse, even if this young woman, Mary, was older than the papers claim to be,
Hmm.
because the papers are going off of the information the
Yeah.
family supplied.
Hmm.
I feel like there's had to have been some level of abuse in her life, and I feel
Exactly.
awful for that. Of course, this is all speculation, but the
Yeah.
bottom line is I wouldn't wish anybody to live in
Hmm.
an early 20th century
Insane
asylum
asylum.
of
Yeah.
any kind. It just
Yeah. And
doesn't sound like it's a positive thing for anybody.
yeah, and it's
And
interesting because I think you brought up the looking for notoriety through of like the family in Montana, doing these things for some notoriety purpose.
mhm.
I guess I just don't know enough about like maybe just being famous for any reason was enough, kind of thing. Because like in my head, I'm like, how does having poltergeist activity in the early 1900s in the middle of nowhere serve someone more than it would hurt them? You
Well,
know?
and I would say a couple things to that. I mean, people aren't that different, and I've already mentioned Amityville,
Mm-hmm.
and that was only 50 some years after the fact. And there were book deals, there were movies.
Mm-hmm.
Did they hope for all that?
Yeah.
That probably became more successful than they had anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think a lot of it was that sort of thing. Is it just notoriety? Is it just fame? People do terrible and stupid things every single day for fame. And now in our era, where
Mm-hmm.
there's always a camera,
Mm-hmm.
who should be more aware of that than those of us living today? So
Very true.
I think there's something to be said for that. And I think, too, that they may have been able to or had some idea of a way in which they were going to profit from this. Again,
Mm-hmm.
based on the information that this professor has given, let's just take it at face
Mm-hmm.
value. It seems like they were always kind of conning for some cash. And I point to the Fox sisters, who we've spoken about in the past, and
Yeah.
whose rappings and the seances were very influential. Not even, well, a generation
Mm-hmm.
before all of this is going
Yeah.
on. And I'll extend one olive branch by saying that don't feel bad, because you're familiar with Sophocles? I
Oh
believe it's
yeah.
Sophocles' Antigone, the
Mm-hmm.
play Antigone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Classical Greek
I had,
play.
I, had, I, had, I, had, I had to read it in college. Yep.
I'm sure you did. I read it first time in middle school, and I called it Antigone. And I called it Antigone until the
Yeah.
captain of my hockey team in college
Yeah.
was a classical major,
Mm-hmm.
and I called it Antigone in his face. And I also referred to Herodotus.
Oh
It's
yes.
Antigone and it's
Yeah.
Herodotus,
Yeah.
and I felt very silly for no
Yeah.
good reason. But yeah, so Antigonish.
It's a gosh. No, I've one of many long line of me messing up those words. But yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying about the human condition hasn't changed that much since then as far as our motivations. So even if there, for me, I don't see like the gain. Um, that doesn't mean there needs to even be any.
And maybe it's because it's not something that you would do.
Exactly. Yeah. It's probably me. It's probably my lack of imagination in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting story. I think it brings in some interesting folks from different walks of life and everything, and the fact that there's the Arthur Conan Doyle and Cyclical Research Society tie-ins. I just think it's interesting. It has a lot of things. There's a lot of things going on in this story that we like to talk about. But there's one thing I wanted to bring up because whenever we were talking about this earlier, you kind of took a shot at Arthur Conan Doyle for believing in the Coddington fairies.
I sure did. I couldn't remember they were the Cottonton fairies, but yeah.
Yes. And I'd do it again if I could. One of the things I wanted to bring up with that was, I mean, like two things. One, the center, because at the time he was part of the Center for Cyclical Research,
pretty prestigious group, actually.
Yeah, because exactly. And I think they get a lot of flack, but I mean, at the time, whenever they realized those photos were bunk, they said it. They were also really really instrumental in debunking what's his name, William Hope, one of the big spirit photographers at the time.
Oh yeah, was that the guy that was based outside Toronto? Or
I believe he was a Canadian as
it was
well.
one in the 1920s. It was really
it was around
Toronto.
the same time. It was I believe it was William Hope, but there were others. But he's one of the more famous ones. Realizing his spirit photography wasn't legitimate. I mean, granted, I will say that it is high art, but it is not supernatural.
Well, a quick aside, I remember for my birthday one year, I asked you if we could take photos of me doing that sort of thing with like the cheesecloth and everything, and that was a fun time. We ought to revisit that.
Yeah, and I've actually been thinking about getting back into basically faux spirit photography as a thing. So if anyone out there wants to do spirit photography with me that is not spirit related, let me know. But anyway,
you can't see, but my hand is already up.
Exactly. Yeah. One taker. So like the society did, like when they saw stuff that wasn't real or didn't jive, they weren't afraid to call it out, because Arthur Conan Doyle ended up actually leaving the society over that stuff because he thought it was,
he was pretty adamant.
He was. So like he at least stuck to his guns over like that. And like he basically everything within the spiritual movement he was just into, you know.
And it's surprising to me because I mean I mentioned of course the scientific detective novels, Sherlock Holmes, which is very well known. Yeah. Still good reads. Emily and I listen to them a lot at night, the radio performances. But that organization had a lot of very scientific, like serious scientific minds in it, and I can see a kindredness there. But he was. I'm glad you brought that up because I couldn't remember for certain, but I thought that he had maintained throughout the whole time that these fairies were quite real.
Even after he the whole time was like, no, those are real. But the thing I wanted to bring up, just to kind of play devil's advocate with that, because like just being a photographer, that's something I think about a lot. Again, the first time I saw the Coddington Fairy photos, I just thought they were just like the most beautiful things I'd ever seen, because it's just like like there's already so much like magic and mysticism for me in photography that I'm like, this goes like so well together, you know.
I can appreciate that,
you know, just purely from an artistic or romantic standpoint, I just thought they were beautiful. But the thing I started thinking about with how widely they were accepted kind of got back to me thinking about the idea of like how we perceive the world around us and how we trust our, especially from an empirical standpoint, how we trust our eyes. Because so many people say, if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. You know, when it comes to things that are paranormal, I have to see it, I have to feel it, I have to experience it for myself. And they're very like, okay, well, I'm only trusting my empirical senses here. I'm not getting into the rational side of things. And when I say rational, I don't mean like rational from like a logistical standpoint. I mean rational as in like you're able to mentally do the work, not physically experience it. I know from empirical experience that stove is hot. I don't think I've ever picked up a hot coal, but I could rationally make that jump to go, you know what? I've never empirically experienced that, but I'm going to rationally not do it. So when it comes to the idea of like we do really trust our eyes and trust our empirical senses a lot. And at a time when photography was coming out, I think there was probably a lot of people who were very intelligent, very rational people who were fooled by different types of basically photo tricks because of things like the Coddington Fairies. Because not only is your brain not used to looking at a photograph, like we've all grown up seeing photographs. We can't imagine what it's like to see a photograph for the first time. Arthur Conan Doyle had to see a photograph for the first time when he was like conscious of it, you know, probably.
Yeah. So I think you're getting, there's a difference between a priori and post terror. There's a word I can't pronounce.
And a posteriori. Yeah.
Thank you. That's again, one based on received, non-deductive, and another based entirely upon experience. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you because, of course, when people are debunking it now, it's not only can we do things with process film that were much more difficult then, but
Mhm.
it's even, I know one of the big things for me, I look at and I say, well, how are those fairies flying? Knowing cameras and shutter
Mhm.
speeds at the time, we would expect to see movement.
Stuff like
And
that. Exactly.
exactly, and
Yeah,
that's not
and
there. It's very
yeah.
clearly just a paper thing sitting.
And that's the thing is they like, he didn't have the benefit of the experience of seeing as many photos as we have to like even know to ask kind of those questions or have those red flags kind of be there.
Or how
And I
to
think
perceive movement and
how to
blur
perceive
in
movement
an
in a
image.
photograph. Yeah. So I think for me, whenever people give, especially the cognitive fairies, a hard time, not just Arthur Conan Doyle, but just in general, people go, oh, how could they look at those photos and think they were real? Like, imagine never seeing a photo with something fake in it. You know,
Well, let me throw
like
this out
they've
then.
they've never had that experience before. So I think it's a little more reasonable than we give
Let
people
me
credit for.
play, because I hear your argument and I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
it's fairly sound. But
yeah.
let me play
Please do.
devil's
Yes.
advocate and say
Our favorite game.
deviled cubed. Let me throw this out there. I mean, daguerreotype goes back, what, 1830s?
Roughly, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
what I'm getting at is we have
okay.
film. I mean, Conan
Yeah.
Doyle looking at the Coddington fairies, that was 1910.
Probably
Even
about,
if
yeah.
it's even
Yeah.
if it's
I'm gonna look it up.
1900,
Yeah.
we've got at least 20 years of knowingly doctored film going around, right? And staged photographs that they knew contemporaneously to be doctored film. And so I say,
yeah, 1917. You're right. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not, Arthur Conan Doyle may have been gullible.
Yes.
He may have embarrassed me from beyond the grave on a few occasions, but I don't think he was a stupid person.
Yes,
and
that's
maybe photography just wasn't an area that because look, I've talked about this. I am not super internet savvy. It's I can use the tools, but I really don't use the internet outside of work and email and this. Like, I don't go looking up websites very often. It's not because, so when there's a lot of like specific internet culture and internet talk, I'm out because it's not that I don't live in this time period or have
just not your,
it's not that I don't have access, right?
Yeah, just not your
it's
thing.
just not something that I have really any interest in or enough time to. And so that's maybe, let's give benefit of the doubt, he lived in an era where photography was just a known thing and had been for some time, and maybe he just wasn't very interested in it until it crossed into a subject of which he was clearly immensely interested.
Exactly.
And so he was less critical of it, maybe because he didn't have the knowledge, as you kind of talked about. And maybe it's just he wanted to believe in something so much. I think anything that reaffirmed.
I think you're right. I think the idea of wanting things reaffirmed is great. I mean, look at the paranormal world today. Like, people, like, that's all most people are looking for in ghosts, Bigfoots, UFOs. All they want is to prove things, which, again, me and you have talked about numerous times. I don't think that's the point to any of this. I think we have someone like Arthur Conan Doyle who is very scientific. The thing that comes from being very scientifically minded and being critical, sometimes you're going to be wrong. Sometimes you're going to look at something and go, yes, this passes the test for me, and it's not real, And I think that when you look at especially this time when spiritualism was like at its peak, just starting to decline, you have, I think, this is right after World War One. I think you have people that are very much like, listen, can't we just have fairies be real? Like seriously, it's just like, let us have a
return to innocence.
Yes, I think that's part of it. Like if I went through, World War One, II, and
you just saw like the first real mechanized war.
Yeah, exactly. And then
gas being used.
I can understand. Yeah, I can understand someone being like, listen, these young girls that seem seem normal enough. Do I really want to call them liars? You know, like
there is that too.
Like does that feel great? You know, there could have been a social element to it as well. But again,
there's not calling children liars, and there's not the encouragement of it. But
correct. No,
I think you made the point is deeper. You say that it's the prove it is not the point. I have a mixed reaction to that. I agree with you. I think the point is deeper. I think these stories ghosts don't have to be proven to be real in order for them to say something more about us and about the human experience. And
absolutely,
I made my point, my belief in lack thereof very clear. I'm not entirely shut off to it, because I guess I could imagine a world in which, especially like the stone tape sort of stuff, that repetitive sort of thing, I guess I can wrap my head around that being maybe a possibility, although I don't see. I'll shut up about that. The bottom line is, I mean, they don't have to be real to say something deep about us. And if there weren't the fear of death, or if there weren't the finality of life, a very stark conclusion, we wouldn't romance them in the way that we do and see their presence in every culture. I am not aware of a culture, and I'm sure there's at least one out there, where they don't have some sort of after death return.
Yeah, or some
sort of shade that moves across. Right. Yeah. It's and I think that's part of, the,
like you said, the human experience.
Was the Freud thing, the future of an illusion, the fear of death. And that fear is going to be with us for some time, because there's beyond the empirical, beyond the materialist, we don't and we can't answer what happens beyond that. And even the most starkest atheist, I think at some point, the most, has to say that, we have no reason to believe that there is anything beyond, but it's not something that we can prove, that there isn't anything beyond the mortal coil.
Yeah.
Which is a fun phrase. Or beyond the veil, that's another good one. I kind of like that one a little better. Although veils tend to be translucent, so you think you catch a peek of what's going on back there.
Exactly.
But any claim that you make is a claim that's made without any evidence, unless of course you've had one of these sort of experiences and you've tried in earnest to find another thing. And I guess that's one of the things beyond the romance of history and of time that keeps me so interested in all this.